So hello everyone and welcome to the Riverwood Conservancy's webinar, The Pileated Woodpecker with Dave Taylor. My name is Stephanie. I'm the Community Program Coordinator at the Riverwood Conservancy. I hope you are all doing well and staying safe and getting outdoors. I want to say special thanks to Credit Valley Conservation for supporting all of the work that we do. Before we get to our presentation, I just want to mention that all of our June programs are now live on our website, as well as our July programs actually as well. So please register for as many free programs as you would like. On your screen now, you should see our entire calendar of virtual events. We have a lot of interesting guest speakers, so please check them out. Anything highlighted in yellow are programs that are coming up and are open to watch. And we're also easing our way back into in-person events that adhere to public health guidelines. We'll be offering outdoor yoga and outdoor meditation events every week through July and August. Spaces are limited, so please register for as many sessions as you'd like at the riverwoodconservancy.org/events. And if you would like to support our virtual and hopefully soon in-person programs and conservation of Riverwood's habitat and wildlife, please consider donating on our website. Before we get to our wonderful speaker today, the Riverwood Conservancy would like to acknowledge that the land on which we operate is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Haudenosaunee nations. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this place is still home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. And today we have Dave Taylor back with us again, who is a wildlife photographer and the author of more than 40 books on wildlife and ecology. His most recent book, Black Bears: A Natural History, is available now. Dave also focuses his efforts on producing educational videos and material about wildlife for both the public and to support school curriculum. And we'll actually be posting links in the chat in a second for those. He has traveled throughout the world capturing nature with his camera, and he frequently visits Tanzania where he guides wildlife safaris. Dave taught science and geography for more than 30 years and nature photography at Humber College for more than 25 years. And today he is a consultant for the Riverwood Conservancy. So welcome back, Dave. We also have one of our wonderful volunteers today, Shaista, who will be helping me ensure that the webinar runs smoothly. So thank you, Shaista, for being here as well. And if you have any questions during the presentation for Dave, please type them in the chat, Q&A, or comment section, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. And today, if you are watching with your class, please share in the chat the grade, as well as the number of students in your class that are watching. That would be greatly appreciated for our numbers. So Dave, I will hand it over to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, Shaista, and welcome everybody to this talk on the pileated woodpecker. I am trying to, in this series of talks, vary the location from an exotic one to a location that is basically Riverwood centric. And the pileated is very Riverwood centric. So before we go into the talk, let's take a look at the pileated woodpecker. I want you to imagine that we're out in the woods. We're able to sneak around rather quickly through the seasons, and we'll take a look at the pileated woodpecker without any narration. Just enjoy it for a second, and then we'll talk about what you're seeing and help you understand it. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this is going to work. So that's your introduction to the pileated woodpecker. Pileated woodpeckers are our largest woodpecker, and I think you can tell from the video why they call it a woodpecker. It is good at pecking at wood, but it has special adaptations for that. And I wondered if you noticed as you're watching the video, its tail. The woodpecker's tail is very stiff, and it uses it to support its body against the tree when it's going up a tree. We can show that better if I switch to another program. I'm just going to switch over to it. And this is a series of slides. And both these programs are available on my YouTube channel, and Stephanie is going to share the link with you. I think you should be seeing that now. So this is a PowerPoint presentation, and let's talk about woodpeckers first. If you are out at Riverwood, you're going to see woodpeckers, and most likely you're going to see this one or this one. And the way you can tell them apart is their size. The one on the left is the hairy woodpecker. The one on the right is the downy woodpecker. The downy is smaller, and it has much smaller beak, but they look very similar. These are both males. Well, how do you know? Well, it's because of the red on the back of their heads. If we take a look at just the downy woodpecker, this is the female, and she lacks the red, but otherwise she's very similar in size. Smaller than a robin. The hairy woodpecker is about the size of a robin. There are all sorts of woodpeckers you can see around the world. They all have certain features in common. They all have the stiff tail. They all have very, very thick beaks. They all use those beaks for pecking at something. It's not always wood. In this case, it's a palm tree, and palm trees are not made of wood, actually. You notice these woodpecker pictures are from all over the world too. This is down in Texas, and some woodpeckers will come to feeders. This one's got a sunflower seed. They like to get the food that they like to get. This is in the island of the Dominican Republic. This is the Hispaniola woodpecker. It's a woodpecker that tends to live in colonies. Not many woodpeckers do that. So if you see one of these guys, you're probably going to see more than one. This is a woodpecker that spends a lot of its time pecking at the ground. It's really an anteater, and will go along the ground and actually peck into the ground to get its prey. This one likes sap. This is the northern yellow-bellied sapsucker. So woodpeckers are found throughout the world. In fact, the only continents that do not have woodpeckers are Australia and Antarctica. This woodpecker, the red-headed woodpecker, was once pretty common in southern Ontario and has just about vanished. You don't see it very often. I think in the last, I've been at Riverwood 17, 18 years now. I think there's been one sighting. We would love to get this guy back on the property. So these are the woodpeckers, at least some of them. There are rather over 100 woodpeckers in the world, well over 100. And this is our subject for the day, the pileated. It's very distinctive. It's got a very red crest. In fact, there's nothing subtle about this woodpecker. It's large, it's about the size of a crow, got a bright red crest, and it's very noisy. You could hear its call throughout that video that you saw. As I said, it's about crow size. This is where it's found. So the purple indicates its range. And you'll notice that it likes a variety of habitats. It can be found in Tennessee. It can be found in the Great Smoky Mountains. It can be found in the mountains of British Columbia and along the coast. It can be found in South Carolina and Florida. It can be found at Riverwood. Riverwood, we think, in the Riverwood, greater Riverwood ecosystem, we think there are probably 2 pairs of these woodpeckers living in that area. They're not common. And so if you see one, it's pretty exciting. Now they can be really calm and cool and collected around people. So you may, if you see them, you might get a good look at them, but seeing them is relatively rare compared to the other woodpeckers. They are found up in Algonquin Park and in the boreal forest. They are found down on the tip of Florida. This is Sanibel Island, and I've seen them many times on palm trees there. The one on my right is on a telephone pole. Maybe the telephone pole is infected by ants, but it could also be using the telephone pole to drum. One of the ways they intimidate other pileated woodpeckers is by drumming either between 11 and 30 loud taps that let other woodpeckers know, hey, I'm here. The picture in the center shows a pair of them. But can you tell which is which? Anyhow, they're found in the cypress forests of South Carolina, North Carolina. Wherever you find old growth forests or old trees, you're likely to find pileated woodpeckers from the Rockies to the south. This is in Maine. Now, as I said, there's nothing subtle about this woodpecker. It's large, it's brash, it's loud, and when it makes a hole, it makes a big hole. That hole is probably 30 centimeters high, and they'll excavate that into usually dead trees because there's a lot of carpenter ants in there. There might be a lot of beetles in there, and they will start to feed on them. They can do so much damage to a tree and put so many holes in it that the tree, especially once it's dead, will actually break in half where these woodpeckers have been doing the excavating. It's a pretty cool thing to see, but you have to watch out for it when you're walking through the forest. Now, a lot of people think they grab their prey with their beaks. That's not true. If you watch the video very carefully, and I suggest that maybe you go back and play it, you'll see the tongue darting out like a snake's tongue, and it's lapping up the insects. The tongue actually goes, not like your tongue, it wraps up around the top of their head. So when they activate that muscle, it shoots out and flicks back in very quickly. Their tongue is much longer than our tongues. There you can see the tongue. See it just going out? They nest in holes that they excavate. And these holes are very important for other animals. The woodpecker only uses their nesting hole one season. So once they leave it, the hole is left there. So you find things like flying squirrels will use it. Small owls will use it. Even raccoons will use it if they excavate it a little bit. It's very important for the ecology of a lot of nesting birds. Wood ducks nest in these holes. So do golden eyes. A whole variety of birds might make use of it. So they're providing a service. Now, when they fly, most woodpeckers fly like this, up and down and up and down. But with the pileated woodpecker, it flies like a crow, so it tends to fly fairly straight. That's unusual among the woodpeckers. It's just this woodpecker family that this one belongs to, the subfamily, that do that kind of flying. Now, here's a close-up of a pileated woodpecker. Is it male or female? Well, you look at its mustache, and the mustache comes back behind the bill, below that white stripe below the eye. And if it is black, then it is a female. If it is red, it's a male. Now, this one is not a female. This is a juvenile male. This is the little guy that you saw flying out of the nest. And he is just starting to get that red. They will land on telephone poles. They'll thump on metal, anything to make their pounding sound louder. These are not migratory woodpeckers, so they stay in the same area. So our woodpeckers at Riverwood are our woodpeckers. If you have a pileated down where you live, That's your woodpecker. The youngsters, however, disperse, and they're not tolerated in the adult territories unless they are the offspring of that particular pair, unless it's winter. In winter, when the birds are moving about trying to find their own territories, the adults don't waste time chasing them off. The pairs stay together for life. This is a male. Now, take a look at the feet. Woodpeckers have another adaptation in their feet. Most birds have 3 claws forward and 1 claw back. For the pileated woodpecker, it's like 2 claws forward and 2 back. But the claws are, their toes are really quite movable. In some pictures, you'll see they're quite close together. In others, they're spread quite far apart. This allows it to get its balance on various surfaces. They will feed quite close to the ground because carpenter ants tend to be found apparently closer to the ground. So these woodpeckers, I've seen them on the ground feeding. I've seen them feeding on stumps that were no higher than my kneecaps. So they are quite versatile in their feeding habits and locations. This one is feeding on a very low stump. You can see the plants in the background. So that's an introduction to the pileated woodpecker. I'll stop here. And now let's take some questions and discuss the pileated and see if I can answer them.
For sure. Thanks so much, Dave. The first one that came up actually was on Facebook. And a student is wondering what a woodpecker baby is called, if there is a certain specific name for them.
I believe they're called chicks. I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question.
Stumped ya.
They could be woodpeckerlets, but I think they're chicks.
Okay.
Good question.
How many babies can they have, Dave? That's William in grade 1 would like to know.
Well, William, they'll lay up to 5 eggs. Whether or not they can raise all 5 to fledgling. Fledgling is when they fly to the nest. Depends on how much food is available.
Right.
And I believe the eggs are not laid at the same time, so they're a day or so apart. So the young birds, the first hatch, have a better chance of getting most of the food. But once they're out of the nest, the parents pretty much don't do a lot. They don't feed them that much out of the nest. The youngsters are pretty much on their own.
And there's a lot of questions coming in about palm trees. What are palm trees made of? What food are in palm trees?
Well, palm trees are called trees because they're tall, but they're really kind of a corky substance. So they're thick, but they're not thick like and as hard as wood. This gets a little theoretical, but here we go. A tree, there is no such thing as a tree. A tree is kind of just a term we use that we say all these things with big branches are trees, and all these things that don't have big branches are not trees. But some trees are actually members of the carrot family. Some trees are members of the bean family. So it's an idea, it's a concept we as humans do. So when we go walking in the forest, we don't have to say, well, that's a big bean tree and that's a this. We just call them trees. It makes our lives simpler. There's no such thing as birds, by the way. Birds are now classed as non-avian dinosaurs, but we're still going to call them birds because that's what people are used to. So the palm tree is called a tree just because it's tall and kind of like a tree, but most trees branch, and there's only one palm tree, and that's one I see on safari in Africa called the doom palm tree that has branches, but it's not like the branches on a regular tree. So palm trees have palm leaves. They're very different, but you know, people when they found North America or discovered the world weren't doing DNA analysis. They were just looking at things and they said, that's a tree. And they threw the palm tree in with it. So it's just a way of organizing the world that makes it simple so that we can all kind of get along and talk sort of the same language. But if you were a real tree scientist, you would talk in Latin terms and specific.
I think,
boy, they're tough questions today.
yeah, I think the teachers are going to have a lot of questions about that concept after this presentation, Dave.
Good luck.
Jen from Facebook is wondering, or actually Reese, who is in their class, is wondering how long pileated woodpeckers live.
I think less than 10 years. I think 11 years is kind of the record. I think in captivity they've lived a bit longer. But most pileated woodpeckers, when they don't survive their first year, there are all sorts of predators out there that will take them. Cooper's hawks are really good. Some Cooper's hawks actually kind of specialize in them. Raccoons will get into the nests. If they're caught on the ground, a fox might grab one. There's owls are big hunters of them. So to survive the first year and learn how to be a pileated woodpecker, that takes a lot of doing. If they do survive the first year, then they've got the likelihood of a much longer life. But 10 years is about it. And they'll start breeding in their second year, if they can find a territory. And what happens when they find a territory, the male goes in and he picks the tree and he makes the hole in the tree. And then his bride, his wife, comes along and she inspects the tree. And if it's not good enough, he has to go make another one. And when they're first starting out, he has to prove to her that he has good taste in making holes in trees. And once they're together, they tend to stay together. Oh, the other thing they'll do, and this is really unusual for birds, if a robin's nest gets destroyed, the robin might move on. Actually, that's not a good example because robins will nest 2 or 3 times in a year. But most birds, once their eggs are destroyed, that's it for the season. Not the pileated. They'll find another nest and they'll start over again, which makes them kind of unique. Next question.
There's tons of questions coming in. So just so everyone knows, we are not going to be able to get to all the questions, but I'm going to try to pick some of the more popular ones. We do have a question coming in on Facebook. Agnieszka has asked, what area in Riverwood can I spot them?
Not in the gardens. That's about or the fields. But certainly around the chapel house, there's some old dead trees there. And you can even see the works of some of the pileated in some of those trees. That's where some of those pictures were taken. Along all of the trails in Riverwood, you have a good chance of seeing the pileated. And what you want to do is you want to listen for it. And I'm going to play you the call. This is what it sounds like. Or if I can get the thing to work. There we are, push the wrong button. Is that coming through? I'll turn the volume up a bit. Try that again. So what I would do if I'm out in the woods and I hear that call, if I had binoculars, I would start looking in the trees and trying to locate it. And usually, well, they're a big bird, but sometimes at the top of the tree, they're hard to see. But they'll usually fly from tree to tree, and that gives you an opportunity to spot them. Sometimes you can get very close to them, although I would really suggest that you don't go off the trail at Riverwood, just because there's poison ivy, there's possibly ticks. You want to stay safe, so look at them from the trail. I have seen pileated woodpeckers that just put on a wonderful show for me and didn't fly off. And then I've had pileated woodpeckers, as soon as they saw me, they were gone. There is one other woodpecker that I just want to mention here. Sometimes in the spring, you'll hear this call. This is the northern flicker. That sounds a lot like a pileated to my ears if I wasn't thinking about what I was listening to. The pileated woodpecker is short, it's called a shorter, and it repeats. The northern flicker is much longer, but they're both very loud. Now, if you hear a woodpecker calling in the winter, that's almost certainly going to be, if it's loud like that, it's almost certainly going to be pileated because the flickers migrate. The pileated do not migrate. So in the winter, you can be pretty sure what you're hearing, but take along a guide and listen to the call and you'll be able to pick it up pretty carefully. It's much shorter in two parts for the pileated. Next question.
Noah in grade 3 is asking, are they invasive or are they native? And there's also lots of questions coming in both on Facebook and in Zoom about if there's any endangered types of woodpeckers.
There are certainly endangered types of woodpeckers. Fortunately, I can't think of any in Canada. There is one in the United States called the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker, which looks a lot like the pileated woodpecker, except its bill is quite white, hence the name ivory. It was believed to be extinct. Somebody believes they photographed it about 15 years ago. And then the whole, it was like the Holy Grail. Everybody wanted to go see this woodpecker. Birders flocked to the area, pardon the pun, but nobody saw it again. So does this woodpecker still exist? We don't know. Right. If it exists, it's probably one of the most endangered species in the world. Most woodpeckers are doing fairly well. They have entire books on woodpeckers, and I don't know if you can see the pictures here. There are a lot of woodpeckers in the world, an awful lot. And in some places in the world, sadly, some of them are endangered because of habitat loss. As for our pileated, it is a species of least concern, which means it's doing fairly well. We were really concerned when I came to Riverwood that we left the trees, the dead trees standing. So Douglas Markoff and myself met with the city forester and we said, they wanted to clear out some trees. And we said, that's fine, but leave the stump standing. And actually an example of that is where the owl sculpture is. We topped them off. I'm not really sure I like them being topped off, but by leaving them standing, we're providing a habitat for these woodpeckers. So if you walk around Riverwood, you might see some tall dead trees that are just standing there in the middle of the forest. These trees are really important for the pileated woodpecker and other wildlife at Riverwood. And lots of people do this. This isn't a concept that was new to Riverwood, but it was one that we fought for because we wanted to maintain the habitat for this particular species. They can do fine in places where they don't have these trees, but they do need to have some fairly dead lumber around because that's where they're going to find the carpenter ants and the beetles and whatnot. So they are doing better than I think people expected. And I think the numbers have actually increased because farmers have let some of their forests grow older. Next question. These are good questions, guys. I'm really impressed.
Yeah, pretty impressive, eh? And I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear, I have a little bit of construction upstairs going on, so I'm sorry if it interferes.
I can't hear it.
Okay, perfect. Another great reason to protect Riverwood is to protect that habitat for things like woodpeckers, right? Mm-hmm. I think that the Ivory-Billed Woodpecker went extinct, which we don't have a confirmation on that, but because of habitat loss. So another really great reason to protect Riverwood and places that have these habitats for our woodpeckers. Another question from Carson in grade 1, how many woodpeckers live in Canada and how many different kinds of woodpeckers live in Canada?
Ha! Carson, I really don't know the answer to that because I'm not as familiar with the Western species. I can tell you if you come to Riverwood, you can see the downy woodpecker, which you saw a picture of. You can see the hairy woodpecker. You might see a sapsucker, although that's not that common. You'll see a northern flicker. You'll see the red-bellied woodpecker, which is a relatively new arrival, and I'm going to be doing a talk on it, probably in the fall. And you could see the pileated. So there's about 6 species. And if you're walking the trail, you'll see a poster for Armstrong that has all of these species on them that I designed a while ago. So that's it for Riverwood. In Ontario, there are some ladderback woodpeckers and other species that you can find further north. But we have 6. I think Canada probably has in the neighborhood of 15 species, but I'm guessing on that. Good question. Something that you can look up on Google, or whatever you use. So that is a good question.
Another common question coming in on both Zoom and Facebook. What are trees they usually hang out in, and what do they eat that are in those trees?
They hang out in any big old dead tree. And they'll hang out in living trees as well. The tree has to have an infestation of some sorts of insects. The more bugs that are there, the more they're going to stay. Now, if you watch the video again, you'll see the first sequence, it's not eating insects. It's not eating insects, it's eating berries. They will eat berries, they will eat seeds, but they love insects. So an old dead tree is probably going to be just filled with beetles and carpenter ants and other insects that are feeding inside the tree underneath the bark. So basically I look for old dead trees, but they're opportunists. They'll go wherever they can find food. So it doesn't matter what the tree is. It'll go to a palm tree in Florida, it'll go to an old cypress tree, it'll go to redwoods, it'll go wherever it can find the food. So there's no set answer to that.
Another really great question coming in. And if you have a couple more minutes, Dave, for more questions.
Oh, yeah, we're good. Let's go for another 10, 15 minutes.
Sure. So Hamna in grade 6 asked, why don't woodpeckers get headaches?
Well, that's a good question. Their brain has got some padding around it, so that if you lurch forward real quick in a car accident, your brain starts going forward as well and hits the front of your skull, and that will give you a heck of a headache. The woodpecker's brain is protected against that. So when it's doing that pounding, it has some padding there to stop it from doing that, from stop its brain from going forward. We don't have that padding. Bighorn sheep who fight like this and come with their heads together, they have that padding. In their case, there are large holes in their skull. They make it like a honeycomb, and they kind of are spongy and they collapse and they open up. And I think that's the same with the woodpeckers. Not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it's true. So they have a lot of padding, and they're designed, the way their bill's designed, it's designed to transfer the hit and the energy back from it, to dissipate it a little bit so it doesn't do as much damage to their skulls. You would not be well advised to go around and peck at a tree with your mouth or your nose. I think you would find that that would be very, very painful, and you'd probably stop doing it very soon. And there are other birds that peck at trees. None of them are really quite as well adapted as a woodpecker. You'll see nuthatches going up and down the trees, the bark, and they have bills, but they're not picking at the tree. They're kind of reaching underneath the bark and grabbing the insect, so they're not entering it. So the woodpecker is really, it's evolved for this. I mean, it's got the stiff tail feathers, it's got the feet that support it. It's just a wonderful piece of engineering, pretty cool for a dinosaur, really, you know. And we mustn't forget that they are in fact dinosaurs. That's really going to confuse the teachers. That's good. Have fun with that one, my friends. Next question.
And Dave, what about the tongue that wraps around the head, the skull? Does that help with the, I have an image if I can share it.
Okay, I was just going to get one. If you've got one there, that's fine.
Yeah, I can share it here. You see this image?
Yep.
So does that help with the pecking of the wood to stop from the damage of the brain?
I really don't know. I've never read anything that suggested that. You
Right.
might think that because it's piled back up in there, it gives it some protection, but I suspect it is not relevant.
Okay.
But then again, I'm not a woodpecker. And that happens to be affiliated too. That's a good choice. Pictures.
Awesome. Okay, so more questions coming in. There was a question that I answered in the chat about a woodpecker pecking on an outhouse at somebody's cottage.
Yeah.
And I suggested that they use that for communication as well. It's not just always trying to find food, but sometimes they communicate using those sounds. And Michael has also posted in the Q&A that a woodpecker pecked at the metal light pole near his house as well. Is this for communication?
This is, well, you're right, absolutely. It is usually it's a male woodpecker, and they intimidate their rivals by being loud. So if you're in a forest and you don't have any metal around, you try and pick a hollow tree and you drum. And you go, and each woodpecker will have a certain rhythm. So if you're good enough, you can tell a hairy from a downy from a pileated. But they will drum, and it gets louder because it reverberates. So in my house, in my neighbor's house, and all the houses around where I live, it's very common in the spring to get woken up to the sound of woodpeckers pounding on our metal eaves troughs, on the metal sidings, whatever gives them that extra sort of edge over another male and make them sound like they're bigger and more attractive to the females, they're going to use it. And that's what they do. And I think pileateds will actually do the same thing on metal, although fortunately, I've never had it happen in our neighborhood because they could do some damage to your property. But these little woodpeckers, they're really loud, and it's a springtime event. You will not hear it. I don't think you'll hear it in the summer or the fall. I've never heard it unless there's some, I would say if you hear it in the summer and it's in your house, you might want to call an exterminator because there's probably a lot of ants in there. It wouldn't be a good sign. And you don't want carpenter ants or down south termites in your house. That's a good question.
Beth and a bunch of people are saying they really like this question. Beth is wondering, do you know why there is a small pocket in the southeastern corner of Michigan where they are not found? I'm assuming any woodpeckers are found, or maybe just the pileated woodpecker.
I've never heard of that unless that area is completely urbanized or completely devoid of, particularly for this type of woodpecker, large trees. They do require woodlots of a certain size. So Riverwood is big enough for them. But we have a local woodlot that I've never seen affiliated in. I've seen red bellies and hairy woodpeckers. So I think probably it's because the habitat hasn't suited them. They, if you go back to the range map that I showed, I can't go to it from my computer, but that range map, there are lots of gaps there. There are lots of places where there are no pileated because it's either farmland or it's swamp or it's the wrong type of habitat. So why there would be a specific area in Michigan, it's also possible if it's in the southern part, it's the southern part of the range, and there's no woodpeckers south of there either. So it's like saying there's no pileated in Texas. Well, of course not. There's no habitat for them. So
great questions today.
Yeah.
Two questions coming in from Miss Newman's class. First one is, what are predators of this woodpecker, of the pileated woodpecker, and are they carnivores, herbivores, or omnivores? Dave?
They're insectivores. They eat insects. So, but they'll also eat a variety of fruits. So if you wanted to call them omnivores, you could. A lot of birds change their feeding habits from season to season. So you take the robin, so you think of robin, well, that's going to eat worms, which is really strange because the worms that the robins are eating weren't here 150 years ago. They were brought over by the Europeans and introduced. So the worms are an invasive species, at least the ones in New York. But here you got a robin pecking at the worm. So you think robins are carnivores. They're going to eat insects. They're going to eat. But a robin will switch its feeding habits to fruit in the winter. So they'll eat whatever's available. They prefer, at least the pileated woodpeckers and the robins, prefer living prey during the spring and the summer and the fall, as long as they can get it. Once that goes away, they'll switch to other foods. There's more protein in eating an ant or a grub or a worm than there is in eating most fruits. And besides, most fruits aren't available in the spring because they haven't ripened yet. So makes sense. We try and lump things into these categories, and you really find that the categories vary. As to the enemies, because you asked about that too, Cooper's hawk is a big one. Great horned owl will be another one at night, if it can catch a woodpecker that's out. And then you've got raccoons that could raid the nest. You get foxes, they'll grab them on the ground if they can. In some areas further south, there are gray foxes that climb trees. But it's mostly the Cooper's hawk and the great horned owl, I think, that are the prime enemies.
We'll do 2 more questions. How about that? Just because there's so many cool ones, if that's okay with you. There has been a couple questions coming in, both Zoom and Facebook again, about if woodpeckers can mate with other woodpeckers, so different species. I'm assuming this comes from the similarities in how they look, possibly. I would say that's probably evolution,
yeah.
right? Evolution.
I think 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the answer would be no, they couldn't. There's a lot of, we're learning that there are so many variations. I mean, you look in the mirror, you're looking at a species that in the past crossbred with other species. Our species is Homo sapiens sapien. We know that our species crossbred with Homo sapien Neanderthals, with the Devonians. There's about 4 or 5 different species that have mixed together to create us. When I was doing my book on black bears, I thought black bears were black bears and they didn't interbreed with anything else. Turns out I was wrong. Black bears have crossbred with polar bears and grizzly bears and other bears, and it's not common. We're going to do a talk on coyotes and wolves coming up at some point. It's just amazing what's going on there. So can a pileated crossbreed with another woodpecker? I think probably the more closely that other woodpecker looks like it, like some of the South American woodpeckers, the better the chances are. But as species get separated, as groups of animals get separated, they evolve into separate species. And sometimes it's not that they can't breed, it's they don't know how. There are species of monkeys that are so closely related that you would think they would be able to mate quite nicely and have offspring, but they don't know how to do the dance. They don't know the right calls to make. So they ignore each other and they go their separate ways. And I think that's what happens in nature. But we have learned since we've started to develop these DNA studies and understand the genes of these critters, life finds a way, a little quote from Jurassic Park there, and it's much more complicated than we had ever imagined it would be. So that's kind of a non-answer to a really tough question. I apologize for that.
I think that's a great answer though, and that sparks a lot of interest in me, and I'm sure many of the students. I think this is something we need to look into further, but very cool, Dave. I think the last one, And an easy one to show on your screen as well, Dave, is, and we're getting this constantly in the chat as well, how big is a woodpecker tall and how big is its wingspan as well? Can you show us with your hands maybe?
Okay, so a robin would be from my chin, if you're standing up probably to my forehead. A crow would be about up to here, and that's your pileated woodpecker. So not huge. But the downy woodpecker would be down about here. The hairy would be about here. The red belly a little bit bigger. So it's someplace in that range. As for the wingspan, I usually, when I'm taking pictures of birds, try and figure the wingspan is going to be at least 3 times wider than its body. So if the bird is this tall and you kind of convert that to this, then I'm thinking the wingspan is about like that. Now, you can look it up. It's really easy to figure it out. But just generally speaking, if I'm out in the field and I'm photographing a bird, that's kind of the ratio I use. So, you know, it's about 3 times wider. It varies. It's not perfect, but it gives me, because if I'm framing a picture and the bird's wings are going to be up here and out of the frame, I want to make sure that when I frame it, I get the whole bird in. And that's kind of the rule I go by. It's not a scientific rule. It's more based on my observation. But they are, if you see a pileated woodpecker and you're close to it, you're going to think, my, that is a big bird, because most birds are like that big. Your sparrows, your finches, robin is about that big, chickadees are about that big. So pileated at that size is pretty impressive. Now an ostrich, that's a big bird. But that's a story for another day, folks. I think we should wrap it up, I guess.
I think so many great questions today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and asking all of these great questions, and even stumping Dave Taylor himself with some of these questions too. That's pretty great. And speaking of photography too, Dave, I don't know if you want to quickly just talk a little bit about your nature photography course coming up in July as well.
Yeah, we're going to offer nature photography course and tips like I just gave you about the photographing flying birds, but it's going to also be for anybody that is interested in getting to know their cameras and their equipment and nature a little bit better. I've taught courses for Humber College for 25 years in nature photography, and this is kind of simplifying it down a bit and condensing it into 5 or 6 sessions, one of which will be out in the field, and hopefully we'll be able to do that with COVID restrictions. Got my 2 shots. Yay!
Yay!
I encourage everybody else to get there so we can get back to normal. And again, both the videos that you saw are available. Stephanie will post those for you. You're welcome to use them. Take a look at some of the things we talked about. See if you can spot the tongue coming out in the video of the woodpecker feeding. And thank you for coming. It's been great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dave. Yeah, I just posted all of the links, including Dave's Pileated Woodpecker slide talk, his video, and his nature photography course upcoming. All of those links are in the chat bar now, and I will post them for the Facebook viewers in a couple minutes. Dave, thanks again for another wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Shaista.
Thank you for joining us as well, and thank you for helping in the chat bar. And we will see you at the next presentation. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great week.
Take care. Stay safe.